Today I want to share with you a story from my life that I have never told anyone before. Perhaps many of you will find something of yourselves in my journey. This is not just my story, but the story of countless women who have walked similar paths of struggle and sacrifice. I was only 15 years old when I got married. In those days, girls didn't go to school, we only learned household work. Education for girls was considered unnecessary, even wasteful. Our parents believed that a girl's destiny was marriage and motherhood. Nothing more. But I had dreams. Secret dreams that I kept hidden in my heart. I wanted to study, to read books, to become a teacher like the one woman in our village who commanded such respect from everyone. I remember the day my marriage was decided. I was sitting in our courtyard, helping my mother with the evening meal preparation, when my father announced that a proposal had come for me. The family was respectable, they said, and the boy had steady work. I wasn't asked for my opinion, of course. Girls weren't consulted about their own futures back then. The decision was made over tea and sweets between the elders. The wedding preparations began immediately. My mother started collecting items for my dowry, borrowing money to buy things we couldn't afford. I watched her stress and worry about having enough to send with me, and I felt guilty for being such a burden. Sometimes I wished I had never been born, just so my parents wouldn't have to face this financial strain. On my wedding day, I wore a red dress that felt heavy with more than just its fabric and embroidery. It felt heavy with the weight of my changing life, my lost dreams, and my uncertain future. As I sat through the ceremonies, I kept thinking about the school books I would never read, the lessons I would never learn, the teacher I would never become. After marriage, when I came to live with my in-laws, my entire life changed overnight. The house was larger than ours, but somehow it felt smaller because I had no place in it that was truly mine. I shared a room with my new husband, a man I barely knew, and during the day I worked under the watchful eye of my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law was not a cruel woman, but she was strict and demanding. She had her own way of doing things, and I was expected to learn and follow exactly. From sunrise to sunset, there was work to be done. Cooking for a family of 8, cleaning the house, washing clothes by hand, taking care of the animals we kept in our small courtyard, and countless other tasks that never seemed to end. The work was exhausting, but what was harder was the loneliness. I missed my mother terribly, missed the familiar sounds and smells of my childhood home. Here, everything was different. Even the way they prepared tea was different from how my mother made it. I felt like a stranger in my own life. My husband was a quiet man, kind but distant. He worked as a laborer in construction, leaving early in the morning and returning tired in the evening. Our conversations were limited to basic necessities. I longed for someone to talk to, someone who would understand my feelings, but there was no one. The financial situation was always tight. My husband earned enough to feed the family, but there was never anything extra. No money for small luxuries, no money for emergencies, no money to visit my parents' home. I watched every rupee, stretched every grain of rice, and learned to make meals from whatever little we had. Then children started coming, and my life became even more complicated. My first pregnancy was difficult. I was still so young, barely 16, and my body wasn't ready for motherhood. I had morning sickness for months, but I still had to do all my household duties. There was no rest for pregnant women in those days, no special care or consideration. When my first son was born, I felt a love I had never experienced before. This tiny human being was completely dependent on me, and suddenly I had a purpose that went beyond household chores. But along with love came new worries. How would we feed another mouth? What if he got sick? What kind of future could we give him? The early months of motherhood were the hardest period of my life. The baby cried constantly, and I had no idea what I was doing wrong. My mother-in-law gave advice that often contradicted what my instincts told me to do. I was exhausted from lack of sleep, but I still had to maintain all my household responsibilities. My husband tried to help, but he was working longer hours now to earn a little extra money for the baby's needs. When he came home tired, the last thing he wanted was to deal with a crying baby. So most nights I would walk the baby around our small courtyard, singing softly to calm him while fighting my own exhaustion. Money became even tighter after the baby was born. Milk, clothes, medicines when he got sick. All these new expenses stretched our already thin budget to breaking point. Sometimes we had to choose between buying vegetables for dinner or medicine for the baby. The baby's needs always came first, of course, which meant we often went without proper meals. I started looking for ways to earn a little extra money. I began taking in sewing work from neighbors, stitching clothes in the evening after finishing my household chores. The work was hard on my eyes, especially in dim lamplight, and my fingers often bled from the constant needle pricks. But every small payment helped buy something for my son. When my son was 2 years old, I became pregnant again. This pregnancy was even harder than the first because I now had a toddler to take care of, along with all my other responsibilities. I was constantly tired, constantly worried about how we would manage with 2 children. My second child was a daughter, and while I was happy to have her, I also knew that daughters were considered a burden in our society. People would offer condolences instead of congratulations when girls were born. But I loved her just as much as I loved my son, and I promised myself that I would protect her from the harsh realities of being a girl in our world. 2 children meant double the expenses and double the work. I rarely slept more than a few hours at a time. The baby needed feeding at night. My son would wake up scared or sick, and I had to be up before dawn to start the day's work. My health began to suffer, but I had no choice but to keep going. My husband was working harder than ever, taking on additional jobs whenever possible. Sometimes he would work at the construction site during the day and help at a local shop in the evening. I could see the strain on his face, the worry about providing for his growing family. We were both so young, barely in our 20s, but we carried responsibilities that aged us beyond our years. The worst part was that we never had time for each other. We were so consumed with survival that we forgot about companionship, about sharing our fears and dreams. We lived in the same house, shared the same bed, but we felt like strangers passing each other in our daily struggle. When my daughter was 1 year old, I became pregnant with my 3rd child. This time, instead of feeling happy, I felt overwhelmed with fear. How would we feed 3 children? Where would they sleep? How would I manage the work with 3 little ones demanding my attention? This pregnancy was complicated. I developed severe anemia because I wasn't eating properly, always making sure the children and other family members ate first. I fainted several times while working. But I kept it secret because I didn't want to be seen as weak or incapable. My 3rd child was another son, and by this time our financial situation had become desperate. My husband's earnings weren't enough to support a family of 5 plus his parents. We started borrowing small amounts from neighbors and relatives, always promising to pay back soon, but never quite managing to clear our debts. I increased my sewing work, often staying up until midnight to finish orders. My mother-in-law complained that I was neglecting my household duties, but I knew that the extra income was essential for our survival. I was caught between the impossible choice of keeping my family fed or keeping peace in the house. The children were growing, and they needed more than just basic food and shelter. My eldest son was reaching school age, and I desperately wanted him to get an education. I had seen too many young men in our neighborhood stuck in the same cycle of poverty because they couldn't read or write. I was determined that my children would have the opportunities I never had. But sending a child to school required money for books, uniforms, and fees. We barely had enough for food, let alone education expenses. I started saving every small coin I could, hiding money in a small cloth bundle under our mattress. Sometimes I would go without meals just to add a few more coins to this secret fund. My husband initially opposed the idea of sending our son to school. He argued that the boy should start working as soon as possible to help support the family. But I fought for my son's education with a determination that surprised even me. For the first time in my married life, I refused to back down from something I believed in. I managed to enroll my son in the local government school, which was cheaper than private schools but still stretched our budget to its limits. Every morning, I would walk him to school before starting my daily chores. Seeing him with his small bag and slate filled me with pride and hope. Then came my 4th pregnancy, unplanned and unwelcome given our circumstances. I was exhausted from managing 3 children and working constantly. The thought of another baby terrified me. But abortion was not an option in our conservative society. I had to accept this pregnancy as God's will and find a way to cope. My 4th child was born when I was still only 23 years old, but I felt ancient. 4 children under the age of 6, a demanding mother-in-law, financial struggles, and constant work had worn me down to nothing. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a tired, aged woman where once there had been a girl with dreams. This is when tragedy struck our family in a way that changed everything forever. My husband, who had been working extra hours to support our growing family, started complaining of chest pains. At first, we thought it was just exhaustion from overwork. We couldn't afford to take him to a doctor for what seemed like minor discomfort. But the pain got worse. One morning, he collapsed while getting ready for work. The pain in his chest was so severe that he couldn't breathe properly. We managed to get him to the government hospital, borrowing money for transportation from neighbors who had already helped us so much. At the hospital, the doctors said his heart was failing. He needed immediate treatment, expensive medicines, and complete rest. But we had no money for private treatment, and the government hospital was overcrowded and understaffed. We waited for hours just to see a doctor, and then waited more hours for basic tests. For 3 days, I sat by his bedside in the hospital, praying constantly, holding his hand, and trying to stay strong for him. The children were with my mother-in-law at home, and I worried about them while worrying about him. I felt pulled in every direction, unable to be where I was most needed. On the 3rd night, he looked at me with such pain in his eyes, not just physical pain, but the pain of knowing he was leaving his family in an impossible situation. He whispered that he was sorry he couldn't give us a better life, that he was sorry to leave me with so much responsibility. Those were his last coherent words. He died that night while I held his hand, leaving me a widow at 28 years old with 4 children under the age of 8. The world suddenly seemed like a dark, terrifying place where I would have to navigate alone with no map, no guide, and no safety net. The funeral arrangements were a blur of activity that I watched as if from outside my own body. Relatives came from neighboring villages. Neighbors brought food, and everyone spoke in hushed tones about what a good man my husband had been. But all I could think about was what would happen after everyone went home and I was left alone with 4 children and no source of income. The traditional mourning period lasted 40 days, during which I was expected to stay home and grieve properly. But I couldn't afford the luxury of proper grieving. Within a week of the funeral, I was already thinking about how to survive. The small savings we had were spent on hospital bills and funeral expenses. We had nothing left. People in the village started giving me advice I didn't want to hear. The most common suggestion was that I should remarry as soon as the mourning period ended. They argued that it would be better for my children to have a father figure, and better for me to have someone to provide for the family. But the thought of sharing my life with another man felt impossible. My husband had been my first love, my only love, despite our struggles, and the distance that had grown between us due to our circumstances. I had loved him deeply. The idea of replacing him with someone else felt like betraying his memory. More importantly, I knew that most men wouldn't want to take on the responsibility of 4 children who weren't their own. I made a decision that shocked everyone in my community. I announced that I would not remarry, that I would raise my children on my own. People called me foolish, stubborn, even selfish for denying my children a father. But I had made up my mind. I would find a way to survive and provide for my family without depending on any man. The first challenge was immediate survival. We had no money left, and the free meals that neighbors had been bringing during the mourning period would soon stop. I needed to find work. But what kind of work could an uneducated woman with 4 small children do? I started by expanding the sewing work I had been doing before. I went door to door in our village and neighboring areas, offering to stitch clothes, repair torn garments, and do alterations. The pay was small, but it was something. I would work late into the night by lamplight, often until my eyes watered too much to continue. But sewing alone wasn't enough to feed a family of 5. I started taking on additional work as a house cleaner for wealthier families in the nearby town. This meant walking several miles each day, working in other people's homes for long hours, and then returning home exhausted to take care of my own children and household. The work was physically demanding and emotionally degrading. Some of the families I worked for were kind and treated me with respect, but others looked down on me as just another poor widow desperate for work. They would make me scrub floors that didn't need scrubbing, clean bathrooms multiple times, and do tasks that seemed designed more to humble me than to actually accomplish anything useful. I swallowed my pride because my children needed food. When wealthy women spoke to me rudely or made me wait for hours before paying me, I bit my tongue and smiled. When they gave me leftover food instead of fresh meals, I ate it gratefully. When they criticized my work unfairly, I apologized and promised to do better. The hardest part was leaving my children for long hours while I worked. My oldest son, who was only 8, had to take care of his younger siblings. I would prepare simple meals before leaving and pray that nothing would go wrong while I was away. Many evenings I would return home to find my children crying because they were scared or hungry or had hurt themselves while playing. My mother-in-law, who was getting older and more frail, couldn't provide much help with the children. She did what she could, but managing 4 active children was beyond her capabilities. I often worried about the burden I was placing on my young son, who was being forced to grow up too quickly. Despite all my efforts, money was still desperately short. There were days when we had nothing but rice and salt for dinner. There were nights when I would lie awake, listening to my children's hungry stomachs growling, feeling like I was failing as a mother. The guilt was almost unbearable. It was during this darkest period that I received news that would haunt me for the rest of my life. A letter came from my ancestral village informing me that my mother was seriously ill. She had been asking for me, wanting to see me one last time before she died. The letter begged me to come as soon as possible. I held that letter in my hands and cried like I hadn't cried since my husband's death. I wanted desperately to see my mother, to hold her hand, to ask for her forgiveness for all the years I had been too poor to visit her. But I had no money for the journey. Even the cheapest transportation would cost more than I earned in a week. I was faced with an impossible choice. I could borrow money for the trip, but that would mean my children would go hungry for days. I could ask my employer for advance payment, but I had already done that several times and couldn't impose further. Or I could stay home and focus on earning money to feed my family. Every fiber of my being as a daughter wanted to go to my mother, but every instinct as a mother told me I couldn't abandon my children's immediate needs for my emotional needs. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, and I chose my children. 3 days later, another letter arrived. My mother had died, still asking for me until her final breath. I had missed my last chance to see her, to tell her I loved her, to seek her blessings for my struggles. The guilt and regret were overwhelming. I felt like I had failed as both a daughter and a mother. That night I sat outside our small house under the stars and cried until I had no tears left. I questioned every decision I had made, wondered if I was destroying my family in my attempt to save it. The weight of responsibility felt crushing, and for the first time since becoming a widow, I seriously considered the advice people had given me about remarrying. But then I looked at my sleeping children, and I found new strength. My mother would have understood my choice. She had been a mother herself, and knew the sacrifices that motherhood demanded. I made peace with my decision and promised myself that I would make her proud by succeeding in raising my children well. I increased my working hours, taking on any job I could find. I cleaned houses during the day, did sewing work in the evening, and sometimes worked in people's fields during harvest season. My hands became rough and calloused, my back ached constantly, and I lost weight because I was working more calories than I was consuming. My oldest son continued to excel in school despite all our hardships. His teachers told me he was exceptionally bright and could go far if given proper opportunities. This gave me hope and determination. I decided that no matter what sacrifices I had to make, I would ensure he got a good education. When he reached high school, the expenses increased significantly. He needed better books, uniforms, and fees for various school activities. The government school he attended was free, but there were still many hidden costs. I started saving every possible rupee, often going without meals to add money to my secret education fund. It was around this time that I made another difficult decision. I sold the few pieces of jewelry that my husband had given me during our marriage. These items were my only connection to happier times, my only valuable possessions, and traditionally they should have been saved for my daughter's marriage. But I needed money for my son's education, and sentiment couldn't fill empty stomachs. Taking those precious pieces to the goldsmith was one of the most heartbreaking experiences of my life. Each piece held memories of special occasions, of my husband's love, of hopes and dreams we had shared. But as I watched them being weighed and valued only for their gold content, I reminded myself that my son's future was more important than my past. The money from the jewelry allowed me to send my son to a better school in town. This meant additional transportation costs and higher fees, but I was determined to give him every possible advantage. I started doing extra work in the evenings, taking in more sewing orders and cleaning additional houses on weekends. My son thrived in his new environment. He made friends with children from better families and was exposed to opportunities I had never imagined. Sometimes he would come home with stories about his classmates' lives, their family's prosperity, their future plans, and I would feel both happy for his expanded horizons and sad about our limitations. As he progressed through high school, his teachers began talking about college. They said he had the potential to become an engineer or a doctor, professions that commanded respect and good salaries. The thought of my son achieving such success filled me with pride, but it also terrified me because I knew the costs would be enormous. College meant not just tuition fees, but also lodging, food, books, and living expenses in a city far from our village. It meant years of investment before any return. It meant sacrificing the immediate benefit of having him work and contribute to family income. It was a gamble with stakes I could barely comprehend. But I'd come too far to give up now. If my son could break free from the cycle of poverty that had trapped our family for generations, every sacrifice would be worthwhile. I started planning for his college years, calculating costs, and figuring out how to manage the financial burden. My other children were growing too, and they all showed promise in their studies. My daughter, in particular, was exceptionally bright and had inherited my love for learning. I began to dream of giving all my children the education I had been denied, of watching them succeed in ways I never could. But success requires sacrifice, and mine was far from over. The years ahead would test my resolve, my health, and my faith in ways I couldn't yet imagine. As I looked toward the future, I knew that my greatest challenges still lay ahead. But I also knew that I had found a strength within myself that I never knew existed. This strength would carry me through the darkest times yet to come, through moments when I would question everything, through choices that would leave permanent scars on my heart. But it would also carry me to victories I never dreamed possible. To the day when I would see my children standing proud and successful, knowing that every tear I had shed was worth the joy of that moment. My story was far from over, but I had learned that sometimes the most beautiful destinations require the most difficult journeys, and I was determined to complete this journey no matter what obstacles lay ahead.